Development Project. And he's going to tell us what to make about this program, rather. UNDP is what it stands for, this report, which was released on the 12th of July, which is indicated that Nigeria's multidimensional poverty index has increased from 86 million to 98 million. Quickly tell you exactly what multidimensional poverty, which is, according to the UNDP, a measure of lack which encompasses the various deprivations experienced by poor people in their daily lives, which includes poor health, lack of education, inadequate living standards, disempowerment, poor quality of work, the threat of violence, and living in areas that are environmentally hazardous, among others. But those are the key areas, Sandra.
Yes, indeed. And here's our big hard fact. We have one every day. According to the UNDP and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, 98 million Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty, and 32 million of those are in severe multidimensional poverty. That's a very sobering statistic. That's about half of the population. It means that 1 out of every 2 Nigerians is living in this thing called multidimensional poverty that Aghogho defined. So I guess it's a really important conversation for you and I as Nigerians to have, so that we can know exactly what it is, how it affects you and I, how to identify it, and how we can eradicate it. And we have Ojijo Odiambo on the phone. Hello, sir. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for having me. I'm really pleased to join you.
Yes, of course. It's great to have you on the show. I have to say, of course, that Ojijo Odiambo is the economic advisor for Nigeria and ECOWAS for the UNDP. Now, Aghogho tried to do us the favor of defining what it is, but I think he spoke a lot of big grammar. So could you please break it down what multidimensional poverty is?
Once again, thank you, Sandra. Let me begin by making a correction. The UNDP stands for the United Nations Development Program, not project.
Yeah, program.
Having said that, multidimensional poverty is actually a mouthful, and I choose to view it in a very simple way, in the sense that there's a need to distinguish between the concept of poverty and the concept of deprivation.
Okay.
And once we are clear about the difference between the concept of poverty and the concept of deprivation, then we can understand what multidimensional poverty is. Now, poverty basically refers to a lack of resources with which to meet a need. It simply means that if you are poor, you lack the means, that is the financial resources with which to afford a basic, decent meal, decent housing, decent clothing, accessing health care, and stuff like that. That's poverty. It's lack of resources. Deprivation, on the other hand, is the unmet need, that you have a need which is unmet. The need could be unmet because you lack resources, but it could also be unmet because of other reasons. For example, you can lack resources with which to buy medicine, you can lack resources with which to buy clothing, but you can also be deprived in terms of health just because you could be rich, but you are lacking facilities around you, for example. So deprivation is a measure of the unmet need. It does not tell you why that need has not been met. It could be, for example, you are a rich person, but you choose not to take your children to school. The children will be deprived in terms of education. It's not because you are poor. It could be that you are rich, but for example, there's no facility around you. There's no doctor. There's no medical supplies around you. That means that you are deprived. So there's a distinction between deprivation and poverty. Now, deprivation is important because it's what we see. It's what you and I see at the community level. It's what you and I see in the household. It's what you and I see at the household level and within individuals. Now, multidimensional poverty essentially, therefore, refers to deprivation in various domains. And I think your co-host actually did try to explain that it's a measure of deprivation, which means you have unmet needs in terms of health, you have unmet needs in terms of education, and you have unmet needs in terms of standard of living. That's distinct differently. It's quite distinct from poverty.
And Mr. Ojambo, when the I'm looking at some excerpt of the report, I'm looking at the indicators that were used, and I think the UNDP as well as Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which put out this report, did do well to say that we don't have necessarily the same indices across the length and the breadth of the country. By the time we do the analysis, probably some states are doing far better than others, and then at some local government levels, a lot different there. But when you look at the weighted averages for the different areas you've mentioned, take for example healthcare, and interestingly, we did talk about health yesterday and what we were doing with international partners like the WHO. Would you say, for example, that the strides or the challenges faced in healthcare at the different levels of government, state, federal, and local, you can thread a needle through some common characteristics in Nigeria?
No, the challenges differ by geography. The challenges differ by gender. But I wanted to just highlight one more factor with regards to this multidimensional poverty index.
Okay.
That as opposed to other measures of index, we are looking at the, for example, standard of living. Where is the source of energy for cooking? Where is the source of water, for example? Is it a clean, potable water? What kind of housing is the person living in? So that you see that multidimensional poverty is more representational of the situation that people find themselves in, as opposed to other measures, for example, that just talks about income, but does not relate to the situation and the condition in which people find themselves in. Now, coming back to your question with regards to variation, I think this is one big challenge, for example, and there's no way that poverty and deprivation could be felt equally across the country or across the board. Different gender groups are faced by different challenges in terms of their access to income, in terms of their access to productive resources, for example, in terms of what actually hamstrings their abilities to realize development. So you'll find this kind of variation. And the idea of computing an index of multidimensional poverty is to show how different geographic areas could be different countries, could be different states, could be different LGAs. But you can also do this for different gender groups between men and women, and even look at youth, and even look at children, because these groups and these geographic areas are affected differently by the development process. There are some areas that are lagging behind. The idea, actually, of multidimensional poverty is to have a very detailed analysis so that at least, even at the household level, we can pinpoint, even at the LGA level, we can pinpoint which part of the LGA is more poorer than the other part. Which part of the country, which state is more poorer than the other state? Which country among the African countries is poorer than the other? So this comparison over space, across gender, and over time is very, very important for us to know really what to do. But also important.
Mr. Diambo, sorry to interrupt you. So if you say, for example, which is what traditionally we have sort of narrowed the argument to many times, which is rich or which is poor, you think those sort of definitions no longer exist, or you think they're still valid in today's discussion?
Did you say the rich and the poor?
Yes.
No, they are not invalid at all. They remain very valid, because the rich and the poor, there's still income inequality. There's still inequality in terms of access to basic services, for example, that actually multidimensional poverty measures. So that dichotomy still exists. And the idea of development, when governments do their planning, when they apply their resources using the budget, is to target and address poverty, for example. And that's one of the areas that the SDGs is really focusing on, that we should address poverty in all its forms. And poverty in all its forms goes beyond income, but also the state in which people live, also in terms of their access to health, also in terms of their access to education, also in terms of their access to basic needs that they really need to survive. That dichotomy exists and it remains valid, and it is not invalidated by the fact that we are talking about multidimensional poverty. We're just saying that it's a richer and a more grounded measure of poverty and deprivation. It's not just look at income. It goes beyond income, because income alone only tells you part of the story. The better part is told by things which are not related to income at all. It could be related to institutions. It could be related to governance issues. So we need to go beyond just income and say, what else hamstrings development, and how can this be addressed?
All right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. What are the indicators? What indicators does the MPI use to measure each of the dimensions of poverty? I mean, how do you measure health and education and standard of living?
They use different measures, but in fact, in the area of health, the basic concern is actually nutrition.
Okay.
That's a measure of malnutrition and child mortality. Now, these are chosen because they are universally applicable and data is easily available across countries. Okay. In terms of education, we are using school attendance and years of schooling. What's the average years of schooling? Okay. How long, on average, do people in that particular geographic area, could be Nigeria, could be a state in Nigeria, spend in school? Okay. But the most important thing is the standard of living. And the standard of living here is not just about the income. It looks at, for example, sanitation,
cooking,
access, source of water, source of lighting. Are you using the lantern, or are you using solar, or are you using electricity from the grid? What about cooking fuel? Are you using firewood? Are you using electricity? Or are you using gas, for example? What about assets? What assets do the households own, for example? That's a measure of their standard of living. So it's much broader than just saying that standard of living is equal to income. Because, as I said, income just tells part of the story. That part of the story is told by what we actually observe in a particular household and within a particular community.
Now, let me talk about the assets part of these indicators, right? Asset indicator under standard of living. The MPI has a list of assets, and it says if a household doesn't have at least 2 of these assets, it's an indicator of poverty. So it lists the radio, TV, phone, computer, fridge, animal cart, bicycle, motorcycle. So the MPI is saying if a household doesn't have at least 2 of these assets, it's an indicator of poverty. The first instinct of most people listening to us would be to say, that's easy now. I have at least 3 or 4 or 5 of these now. But isn't it true that we all probably know somebody who doesn't have more than one in their household?
I think there must always be a cutoff point in terms of this kind of measurements. Okay. And that cutoff point helps for cross-country or cross-geographic area comparison. So I think it's a cutoff point. But asset ownership is very important, because asset ownership shows you, for example, the level to which the household has income or has access to information. We know that in this day and age, for example, information is very important. And therefore, radio becomes very important. Just access to information, for example, becomes very, very important. But the cutoff point, which is 2 or more, I think is purposes of cross-country comparison. But it is not the only measure. And Sandra, let me emphasize this. Okay. You can see that there are several other dimensions. And that's why we talk about multi-dimensional poverty. Assets is just one out of the many other dimensions which are considered. So assets alone do not define poverty. Asset is an input into a measure of poverty. They don't define poverty, because that would be very faulty. That's why we look at assets, we look at sanitation. Are they using pit latrine? Are they using flush toilets? How far is the water source? Is it potable? For example, what sort of lighting is there? Access to health? Are the children dying? Is there malnutrition? So we combine all this and say that if a household is deprived in so many of these domains, then it can be considered to be multi multi-dimensionally poor.
Now that you've talked about this, Mr. Odiambo, I remember years ago, if I did carry out research and the methodology in the formation of the questionnaires and the questions to be asked, like income distribution of the state of the households, or how many rooms they have, for example. And the question was asked, for example, whether the children, the people in the house, the level of education they had, and I see the parameter on education. And the classification of people being poor because they haven't been to school long enough for education or haven't attended school by the age of 10. And those children are classified as poor, which I see in the extended report suggesting a large proportion of the poor people, half of 1.3 billion, that's worldwide, are considered to be poor and under the age of 18. So you reiterate the fact or discard the fact that you can classify children who haven't gone to school as being multidimensionally poor.
Yes. I think to make it simple and understandable is that the best way to look at it is that they are deprived in terms of education. I think that's a better way of looking at it.
Okay.
That yes, if you haven't gone to school, if you don't have education, you are deprived. And that's why I always insist that the best way to look at the multidimensional poverty is that it's a measure of deprivation. Are they deprived? And you and I will not know why they are deprived. Is it because there are no schools? Is it because their parents choose not to send them to school? Is it because they lack the resources with which to go to school? So this is basically saying that, yes, they are deprived in that sector. They are deprived in education. They are deprived in health. Then we amalgamate all this. Then we compute an index that say, if so many people are deprived in all these domains, then we consider them to be multidimensionally poor, or in other words, they are multidimensionally deprived. And I think that's the key word. They are deprived in many domains and not just one. And therefore, their state is more dire than somebody who is not deprived in so many domains, for example. Somebody who is only deprived in education is better off than somebody who is deprived in health, in education, and in standard of living. So I hope you see the difference.
Right.
If you just joined us, we have Ojijo Odiambo, who is the economic director for the UNDP. We have him on the show talking about this new data, this new report from the UNDP that 98 million Nigerians are living in multi-dimensional poverty. He's the economic advisor, for Nigeria and ECOWAS. Now, I want to talk about the drinking water indicator. That struck me because I live on the island here in Lagos, and there are lots of neighborhoods here with no access to clean water. In fact, I don't think there is any Nigerian who receives pipe-borne water that is drinkable. Now, how well or how badly, Ms. Ojijo, how do I put this now? Is Nigeria performing on the drinking water indicator generally?
I think there's two issues there. One has to do with definition, and the other one has to do with the actual collection of data and information.
Okay.
I think the definition, I think the data that was used in this particular computation is the Demographic and Health Survey, if I'm not wrong. And the definition is that the water should be available within 100 meters radius of a particular household. It does not necessarily have to be within a particular household. If I recall, in other countries, this is the measure that we have used. Now, let's take that as the definition. It means, therefore, that potable water and safe water should be available within a given distance, and therefore is easily accessible. Now, the other thing is also data, and that is a big challenge. That data, because as you know, garbage in, garbage out. So if there's a problem with data, for example, then it might be misleading. So and that leads me to the critical thing that I think really should be a focus going forward, is to have comprehensive, high-quality data which is up to date, that actually is reliable and that can tell the story. Because at the end of the day, we want to know what the actual situation is on the ground, so that governments, both at the federal, the state and LGA level can tell, for example, you talked about the island, that in the island, in a particular area of the island, there's a lack of water, there's a problem with lack of water, and therefore we should invest in availing water to these particular communities. But they could be having, in that particular area, they could be having access to electricity via the grid. So electricity is a problem, and that calls for the need for a very fine-grained analysis to show in which domains are particular individuals, are particular households, are particular communities deprived, and therefore we target the investments to those particular areas where they are most deprived. I not just say we go and we assume that the whole area is poor. Where are they lacking? Which sectors? Is it health? Is it education? Is it water? Is it energy? And therefore, we should focus our investment on that area. And how many people are affected? Is it women? Is it children? Is it 30%? Is it 40% of the population? That helps in terms of planning. That helps in terms of project execution. That helps us addressing poverty.
You know, when it comes to water supply in Nigeria, we have, and I'm focusing on water. I'm bringing up water because in a lot of ways, it's a problem that almost all Nigerians are facing. And when it comes to water supply, we have a serious infrastructure deficit. We need more waterworks. You've just mentioned we need more treatment plants. We need more piping to carry the water to everybody, just like people who are connected to the grid with electricity. The piping issue is often cited as the major challenge because of the difficulty in laying water pipes in urban areas that are densely developed. Now, what I want to know is how other countries faced this challenge. Have they faced this challenge before? What's the usual way out of it?
Thank you, Sandra. These kind of challenges are not unique to Nigeria. Okay. The intensity could differ, but they're not unique. But the good news is they're not insurmountable. It should begin at the point of laying the foundations, getting the foundations right, at the point of planning urban centers, for example, to provide for the basic infrastructure, roads, water, for example. But not just water to get water to the household, but also how do you get the water that has been used, for example? How is it treated? How is it, for example, treated so that it doesn't pose a health hazard to the local communities? So I think these challenges exist, but there exists technology. We have the knowledge. What might be a challenge and what we may need to address is that do we have the commitment, based on the knowledge that we have, to address these challenges, for example? And I think that's the question that we should be looking into. Do we have the commitment so that we actually address some of these challenges? These challenges exist, but I want to repeat, they're not insurmountable. They can be addressed because we need to be addressed because standard of living is very, very, very important. Access to basic water has numerous benefits, not just in terms of availing water and reducing the tragedy, for example, that women have to face, especially in rural areas. I'm not talking about a high population density area like Victoria Island. I'm talking about rural areas where women walk long distances, spending so much time looking for water. It's just not just reducing the tragedy, but it's also has got serious and tremendous health benefits in terms of reducing waterborne diseases. So it's not just a municipal water issue. You can start to see that by getting the infrastructure right, getting the water to the household, your benefits not just in terms of having water for cooking or for washing, but also in addressing child mortality, for example. We're addressing general mortality in the population. So we should see these things as being interconnected and focus on how do we invest in those areas where we have the greatest synergies that you invest in this one area, for example. I'll just give you another example, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Just making girls to complete secondary education has huge benefits, not just in terms of their literacy and numeracy rate abilities, but also in terms of child mortality, for example, because childbirth will be delayed because people who go to school are unlikely to marry early, and those who marry early, of course, are likely to have more problems during childbirth. So you can see that an investment, for example, in the education sector, focusing secondary completion for girls, has serious benefits on the health side. So these are the kind of things that we should be talking about. And that's why the more composite a measure of deprivation is, the better it is, because you can see in which particular areas are the particular communities, local areas, states deprived and to benefit, and therefore needs to be targeted in terms of public investments by the government. But not the governments alone, and I think I need to highlight this, but there should also be a way of facilitating through the right policy and legal framework for private sector investments, because the government alone cannot do it all. The agenda for development is so huge, the investment requirements are so enormous, the government alone cannot do it. But for example, how do we attract and retain and always ensure that private sector is investing in, for example, water, is investing in energy, is investing in education, is investing in health to complement the limited resources that the government has.
You know, with sanitation, I noticed that sharing sanitation systems with other households is an indicator of lower standard of living and is an indicator of multidimensional poverty. Now, here in Nigeria, we have low-cost urban apartments called Face Me, I Face You. In fact, on the glass ceiling earlier on, we had a huge conversation about Face You, I Face You, Face Me, I Face You apartments and washing plates. And these apartments usually have multiple flats with communal toilets and bathrooms. So those would be considered part of multidimensional poverty?
Yes, in the sense that you know that the more households use a particular facility, toilet facility, the higher the chances of standards being compromised. This is not rocket science. You and I know it, that the more households, we saw it in school, for example, the level of hygiene in a particular school or a community or let's say a correctional facility, it's not the same as the level of hygiene in a household with, for example, 2-3 members. It's easier to take care of the hygiene within a limited number of where there are a limited number of people than where there are many people. And therefore, we are talking here that the dignity of a human being, you know, they say that water is life and sanitation is dignity. Right. We are saying here, if we are going to have many households, many people sharing a particular facility, then the dignity is lowered, the dignity is compromised. And dignity, we are talking about human development as being about dignified living, for example. You cannot live in dignity when your sanitation situation is compromised. So this face you, face me, I think, yes, it's a measure because it compromises on the hygienic standards and therefore the overall dignity of individuals and households.
Mr. Odiamo, let me pick your brain a little. I know you've been in the country for a while. I know you've, I've seen a number of meetings you've had with the government, the release of reports, for example, like the Human Development Index, where we've made slow progress. Well, people say more like snail-like progress over the years with the different indicators that the United Nations seems to measure development with developing countries, especially.
Yeah.
What would you say, for example, when you say that we haven't made much progress, for example, in the indicators for development, which is also mirrored in this report also to looking at areas, health, education, standard of living, and the policymakers look at this document. And they say things, for example, like with the last administration, the economic and recovery growth plan to deal with many of these problems. If you take, for example, I take cooking fuel. I know several administrations have tried to do this in rural areas by providing women stoves rather than they using firewood and charcoal and all of these unsustainable methods of cooking, but it's what's available to them. You think that we've done much, or you don't see any sincerity in the government in the way it's addressing some of these problems?
Let me go back to your first statement, that we have made progress, but the rate of progress has been slow. I think let's start from there.
Good.
Okay.
That the country has made progress, the rate of progress has been slow, which means what we are essentially saying is that we could have made faster progress but we didn't make faster progress. So let's give credit where it is due, that progress has been made. If you see the progress in terms of human development, which is measured by the Human Development Index, it's been a steady rise. But the rate of rise has not been really as fast as we would have wanted, because really governments are put in place and governments are intent on uplifting the living standards of the people, for example. So when you talk about the Human Development Index and, for example, cooking in the rural areas, I think it's just focusing on where are the sectors where if we invested our scarce resources, and I emphasize scarce resources because there'll never be a time when we'll have resources that we can do, they can be used to do everything. Where should we focus those, the public investments so that those, we achieve the greatest benefits? You give the example of various successive governments focusing on improving access to, or energy conservation, I think you said,
energy
supplying energy, conserving cook stoves, for example.
Right.
But this, as you probably know, use woody biomass, for example, either in the form of firewood or in the form of charcoal, for example, which is still not very sustainable because even if you are conserving the source of fuel, but it has a cost to the environment in terms of deforestation.
Does kerosene count?
Yeah?
Does kerosene count?
Kerosene is a form of energy. Yes, it's a form of energy. And for example, if you look at, of course, sometimes it's also a pricing issue. Okay. What is the price of kerosene per liter compared to a price of petrol or diesel per liter? I don't have the figures.
I have no idea.
Yes, but you see, some of these things, from a policy perspective, you want to look at how you lessen the burden on the lower segments of society, the poorer people, because one of the SDG goals, which is SDG number 10, talks about reducing inequality within and between states. And within states means that how do you get the people who are the lowest bottom of the consumption ladder to reduce that gap between them and the rich. And for example, making sure, for example, that you have subsidy, you make cash transfers to them so that they have some income, because ideally these people don't have money. What you need to do, first of all, is to ensure that they have money in their pockets, for example. But their incomes, or providing jobs for them, but their incomes should be rising at a rate that is faster than the income of the rich, so that at least the gap, therefore, between the rich and the poor narrows instead of widening. What we have seen in many countries, and Nigeria included, is a widening between of the income in the gap between the rich and the poor. And this is one of the areas that this kind of measures help us to do, to show that how many people really are experiencing multidimensional deprivation. And where are they deprived? And what can we do so that at least the gap between the rich and the poor can be widened?
Can be narrowed, not narrowed, yes. Now, Mr. Ojijo, we've looked at most of the indicators, but I want to ask you from your vantage point in the UNDP Nigeria office, which are the indicators where Nigeria has the biggest challenge? And why do you think these particular areas are a problem areas for us?
That's a very interesting and tough question.
I'm sure you do nicely.
Let me take my favorite, and my favorite is education.
Okay.
If it is true that some 10 million children are out of school, that means that these people do not have the basic numeracy and literacy skills. That means they cannot be skilled to participate in the labor force. That means they will grow up and live in poverty, and probably their children will grow up and live in poverty. It therefore becomes a vicious cycle of poverty. So it's beyond, if you don't just people being out of school, you can see how it can lead to a vicious cycle of poverty. So I think that education, for example, is very, very important, especially education for girls. Girl child education is so fundamentally important, and there should be a focus on ensuring that all children of all ages have access to education, and at least complete at least up to secondary level of education. Therefore, thereafter, it's easy for them, even if they don't pursue education beyond that, to be skilled in other areas so that they can participate in the labor force and they can be productive members of society that can contribute to the economy, but can also take care of all their basic needs through the income that they earn. That is very, very fundamental. The other thing is the health sector. And you see, they said that Nigeria has one of the highest health burdens in the country. I think there's a need to look at how we can, because what are we talking about? If we are talking about the future, the people must live to see the future. You understand what I mean? If they cannot live because of easily preventable diseases, and they die early, or the children die early, or they're malnourished, they're stunted, and therefore their growth along the path is already compromised from a very early stage, then we are disadvantaging these children because they will not be able to compete with other children who have had access to good nutrition and therefore are well nourished and not stunted. So there are many, many challenges, for example, that we need to look into as a country. And I think the government, through the ARGP, is doing a bit and quite a good commendable job in terms of focusing, because they focus on human capital development. That means focusing on education and focusing on health. But the challenge is there. I think there's a lot that's being done to address these particular challenges.
Now, one of those challenges is a fiscal crisis. How can we invest in healthcare and education, your favorite, and infrastructure? Because I can imagine the effects that infrastructure has on multidimensional poverty. How can we invest in all of these things at a time where and when more than half of government revenue is going to debt servicing? How can we do that?
Sandra, I choose to be an optimist and not a pessimist and talk about financing crisis. I choose to be a pessimist in the sense that there's opportunity in this country to mobilize more revenue. If you look at the tax revenue as a percent of GDP, this is a gross measure that we usually use. It means that how much taxes is being mobilized out of the economy, it is very, very low, which means that we can mobilize more. So I choose to look at it as a glass that is half
full instead of half empty.
And not half empty.
When you talk taxes, Nigerians don't want to listen to you, so you have to be careful.
Yes, but because let's look at the positive side. If a glass is half full, then we see how do we fill it up. But if the glass is half empty, then we see is it going to be depleted? Are we going to lose all the water? So if the glass is half full, then there's a lot of opportunities for doing this. There's a lot of opportunity in instituting efficiency measures in terms of our expenditure, in cutting down on wastage, in tackling, for example, corruption, in tackling, for example, illicit flow of finances. There are many areas where we could actually mobilize more money. So I see that what we should be discussing is how do we mobilize more resources. But even after we mobilize more resources, because I've just discussed with you that there exists opportunity to mobilize more resources through taxation, widen the tax base, because the tax that has been collected out of our economy is very little compared to the size of our economy, which means there's a room there. We could gain a lot by restructuring our expenditure from sectors that are not been, very productive, sectors that are really productive, so that this have spillover effects in so many other sectors. We could cut on wastage. We could tackle corruption. So I see this as the way forward. But let me talk about the infrastructure investment, because you talked about it.
Yes.
And you see, infrastructure is very interesting. I don't know if you're talking about road, rail, and
even the infrastructure for water. I mean, infrastructure is one of the reason why access to water, drinking water, potable water is non-existent as far as Nigeria is concerned. So even that infrastructure.
Okay, that's infrastructure. But let me talk about road infrastructure, for example, road and rail, for example.
Okay.
And we've just done some very interesting work that shows that the benefit that the country would get from investing in rural access roads as opposed to tarred roads and railways are enormous. Because with rural access roads, you're opening up these rural areas. Farmers can get their produce to the market very fast. They can get access to the health facilities. They can get to education. And therefore, maybe it's an area also that from a policy perspective, we should be talking about, yes, We're talking about tarred roads, but also how do we maintain those tarred roads? So these are the kind of things we're talking about. So having said that there exists room to mobilize more resources, I think it's also where do we apply those resources. And I'll just give an example of the road sector where more resources, our studies show that should go to the rural access roads because that has tremendous benefits as compared to tarred roads and railway. But let me come to your issue of water infrastructure. Of course, I think we discussed this earlier, but water infrastructure is also very, very important that we get infrastructure. But at what cost, for example? In high-density areas, yes. But what about the rural areas? Are there more innovative ways of getting water to rural households that are scattered, maybe 300 meters apart or maybe a kilometer apart? I think the delivery system, the service delivery system, will differ substantially in rural areas and in urban areas, for example.
All right. Asante Sana.
Asante, karibu sana.
Thank you very much. Ojijo Ojambo, who is economic advisor for Nigeria and the Economic Committee of West African States for the UNDP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
All right, then. So let's bring the conversation to you who's listening at home. We want to find out how you think that you are deprived. Do you, for instance, have access to drinking water where you live, or do you have to get it from somewhere? You saw the list of assets that we mentioned when we were talking with Mr. Ojijo. Do you know people who do not have at least two of them? I mean, radio, TV, fridge, animal, cart, a bicycle, motorcycle. Do you know some people who do not have at least two of these things? Let's talk about all of these after the break. You're listening to Sandra Ezekwesili.
And I'm Oboh.
Hard Facts will be right back. Is a paid announcement.
Hi there. Were you one of those that when they asked when you were a kid if what you wanted to be when you grew up, you would quickly reply lawyer, doctor, engineer, even broadcaster? I mean, those are noble professions. But did you ever even actually think that you might like to be a farmer? So think about it. I don't see many hands up, actually. Farming was dirty, in air quotes, back in the days, but not today. Do you know that there are a lot of business opportunities in the agricultural sector? First Bank will tell you more of the secrets of that only serious agripreneurs have known for a long time. Just come to the third edition of First Bank Agro Expo tagged Agricultural Value Chain, spotlighting opportunities and managing risks, and see the many opportunities in this booming sector's value chain. This expo is designed to simplify agriculture so that smart people like you and I can see all the opportunities we can take to explore and create wealth. At the First Bank Agric Expo, there will be 3 masterclasses where subject matter experts will share success stories and experiences and provide in-depth expositions on specific areas of the business of agriculture. Now, it will be all-encompassing crop farming, poultry, piggery, fishery, and the entire agricultural value chain. So guys, the best news is that you can attend the First Bank Agric Expo for free. Yes, I absolutely said it's totally free, but you need to register at www.firstbanknigeria.com to secure your seat. That's altogether www.firstbanknigeria.com. Now, the First Bank Agric Expo holds at the Echo Hotels and Suites, Victoria Island, Lagos, on this Friday, 30th of August 2019, and it's holding at 8 a.m. prompt. So make sure you're there. Make sure you register at www.firstbanknigeria.com to guarantee your free entry. The First Bank Agric Expo is for you, so be there.
That has been a paid announcement. Welcome back to Hard Facts.
And we're back. Sandra Ezekwesili right here.
And I'm Aghogho.
And we want to hear from you next. How are you deprived? You listened to the conversation that we had with the UNDP Economic Advisor for Nigeria and ECOWAS, Ojijo Odiambo. And we talked about a number of things. One of them, how to spot somebody who is living in multidimensional poverty. And one of the things they talked about was standard of living. One of the indicators with standard of living was a list of assets. And they said that if you had less than 2 of assets that include a phone, a radio, a TV, a fridge, an animal cart, a bicycle, that's a sign of poverty. My goodness. Do you know people who do not have at least 2 of those items? Do you have access to drinking water where you live? Or do you get it? Do you have to get it from somewhere else? In what ways are you deprived? What types of deprivation do you see in those around you? It's quite the sad conversation to have. But Ojijo said he's choosing to be optimistic instead of, like me, Sandra, pessimistic and always looking at the glass half empty. The glass is always half empty to me, But for him, it's half full. And then for Aghogho, maybe he's just like, let's just drink the water. Where do you stand on the half full, half empty divide?
In fact, that was the first question I asked during an interview many years ago, whether
I see
half empty. I didn't understand the idiom there. I still don't understand it up till now. Well, I think that which is what the UNDP does and the rest of the development people, and layer over layer. And the best example I have is every year I was in university, every semester, I did what we call studio planning. So the questionnaires, they ask about assets, about household. This is what we do every semester, come with analysis and look at how we can understand how development has happened in areas and what has not happened. And the biggest sign to show that development hasn't happened in most old cities was when we give the master plan. The master plan will date back to 1930, 1925, and all those master plans. I will go with those master plans to those areas, whether it's in Oboh, or it's in Ikare, or it's in Elisha. And it's the same thing. There's no difference in the building designs or the footpaths or the roads in those areas.
So while your job was to do the foot
so
work,
we're supposed to update. But there's nothing to update because people hadn't developed those towns. And they still remain the same, years later.
So one of the courses I had to take when I was getting, actually for both degrees, I had to take development communication. And with that, we had to focus on how communication helped to achieve development. If there were more communication strategies geared towards getting places like that to develop or getting government to sit up and do its job, maybe when you went back to do your research or gather your data, you would have had something to update on that list. I guess I am kind of living my dream. I guess, what's I left for school now, they do. right now. Technically,
There's no little update. They designed the same design. Courtyard, everything the same way it was in 1925.
if you just joined us, the UNDP and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative released a report that says that 98 million Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty, and 32 million of those are in severe multidimensional poverty. And when we started the conversation today, we tried to explain what multidimensional poverty is. It's a term that you see all the time or you read somewhere. And our guy basically talked about the global standard for looking at this thing, and there's health, there's education, there's standard of living. It's basically about access to these things. If you don't have access to good health care, no matter how much money you have, it is a type of poverty. If a person cannot get an education, no matter how much money they have, it is a type of poverty. If a person doesn't have some basics of life like clean water, no matter how much money they have, it's a type of poverty. So it kind of sounds like all of us are poor. We have Samuel in Badagry. Hello.
Sandra, good evening.
Good evening. Welcome.
Good evening, Samuel.
Yeah, Aghogho, Shakumako.
Hey, Makushi, my brother.
You see, Sandra, water.
Water.
Yeah, water.
For we, the ball drillers, when we say our slogan is water, then you reply life. When I say water, you reply life.
Okay, so say water. Let me say life.
Water.
Life.
Yeah, thank you, my sister. Sandra, do you know through water, people contaminate a lot of diseases?
Mm-hmm.
And if you happen to have a ball in your compound or wherever, you have to treat it at least three months. At least three months. Water. I think for me, if you don't have water, the poverty is triple multi-dimension.
Oh my God, that's a new one.
Thank you.
Thank you for
very
calling
much,
us, Samuel. We've got more calls. Hello. Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening to you. What's your name?
Henry, I'm calling from Surulere.
Henry, how's our reception in Surulere? Is it very good?
Yeah, it's quite good.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I think the real issue is, like the UNDP representatives were saying, was that these problems are not insurmountable. It's just a matter of whether you have the will. And over time, we've not really had leaders and policy formulators who really have the will, people who really are thinking of making Nigerians' lives better. The average Western politician is thinking, how is he going to make the life of his citizens better? The methods differ. That's why you have their different parties. Over here, they're not even thinking how to make the lives of Nigerians better. So I think people really who are in the know, there should be a platform that is outside government where these people can come together like a think tank, think through these things, proffer solutions, and publicize them. Put them in the daily. The journalists must be involved. Let everybody see this is the problem, this is how to solve it, this is the method, this is the road to follow. So that these people can't have excuse anymore, because really some of them, many of them out there, they don't really have even the ideas. So I think people who are in the know, there should be a platform that they will come together, look at these problems, design solutions, and put them out there in the public, so that the government cannot have an excuse that we don't know how to solve these things. Because that's what they're really telling us, that they don't know how to solve all these problems. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for calling and sharing your thoughts. Our final call is from Devo. Devo, actually, we can't even take Devo's call. That's quite unfortunate. I'm so sorry, Devo, because we're out of time and we need to pay our bills. Okay. On the other side of 6, let's continue that debate from the glass ceiling today. My team on I Beg to Differ have informed me that they want to debate gender roles. I don't know what they're going to bring to the table with that debate, but let's find out after the news at 6. Gender roles, a debate coming up.
99.3 Nigeria Info.